Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are diving into, well, what is arguably the most persistent, the most challenging, and I think for many, the most emotionally charged question in all of philosophy and theology.
It really is. We're talking about the problem of even suffering.
And this isn't just some, abstract intellectual exercise. For millions of people, this exact tension point is the primary reason to either hold on to their faith or to reject it completely.
That is the essential starting block we have to acknowledge. As our source material lays out so powerfully, the strongest argument against belief, the one with the most visceral weight, it's not found in a philosophy textbook.
Yeah.
It's found in the tangible reality of a hospital room, the cruelty you see in a war zone, the reality of abuse, and perhaps the most difficult image of all, the suffering of an innocent child.
And that tension, it's really rooted in the classical definition of a perfect deity, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a definition you see across so many of the world's major theological systems.
It is this idea of a perfect being.
Right. And this definition gives the divine three essential traits, all existing simultaneously, all perfect. And, well, those traits seem to be fundamentally incompatible with the world that we actually see around us.
That set of three attributes, it forms a bedrock of the entire intellectual debate. It's also, as you say, the point of greatest vulnerability. To be the classical God, this deity must be, one, all-powerful. Omnipotent. Capable of doing anything that is logically possible. Two, all-knowing. Omniscient, knowing everything, past, present, and future suffering. And third, and this is the crucial one, perfectly good. Omnibenevolent.
Meaning it possesses a moral will that desires the well-being of its creation, that it would want to get rid of all unnecessary suffering.
Exactly.
So the question just hits you immediately, and it's stark. If such a God exists, one who can stop all suffering because he's all-powerful, who knows how to stop it because he's all-knowing, and who wants to stop it because he's perfectly good, then how can evil and suffering possibly continue to exist?
And that right there is the philosophical problem of evil. For believers, it forces them to create what's called a theodicy.
Which is like an intellectual justification, a defense.
It's a defense of God's goodness and justice in the face of all this observable evil. But for the skeptic or the non-believer, the existence of intense, apparently pointless suffering, well, that's taken as definitive empirical proof to reject the whole idea of such a God.
So our mission in this deep dive is to really explore the complexity of these responses, looking at philosophy and religious traditions from all over. We're seeking clarity, on the structure and the logic of these explanations, their strengths, and maybe more importantly, their limitations.
And we have to hold this intellectual puzzle while remembering, as our sources constantly remind us, that no purely intellectual answer is ever going to fully remove the emotional force of that original question.
Absolutely. Okay, let's get into it. Let's unpack this.
Ah.
So to really appreciate how hard the answers are, we first need to get a firm grip on the intellectual structure of the challenge itself. The problem of evil is often first framed in its classic logical form.
Right, like a syllogism.
Exactly. A syllogism that's designed to show that the very definition of God is, in a sense, internally contradictory.
This is what's formally known as the logical problem of evil. It's not about the amount of evil, just the sheer fact of its existence. It tries to show that the three divine attributes, omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, they simply cannot logically coexist with the observable fact of suffering.
Okay, so let's walk through that syllogism, just what the sources frame it. It starts by relying completely on that definition of God we just talked about.
It does. So, premise one. If God is all-powerful, God could prevent all evil. That seems to follow from the definition.
Makes sense. Okay.
Premise two. If God is all-knowing, God knows about all evil and its causes. Again, straightforward.
Right. No evil is hidden from view.
And premise three. If God is perfectly good, God would want to prevent all evil. This speaks to God's moral character.
And then comes the part that nobody can deny, the simple observation: evil and suffering exist in the world.
Right. And that forces the conclusion. Therefore, the classical threefold definition of God is untenable. Such a God, as defined, probably does not exist.
And it is. It's a tight, elegant, intellectual construction. The power of the argument comes right from its structure. If you accept all those premises, the conclusion seems completely unavoidable.
It does.
So how on earth does the defense even begin to respond to a challenge that's so So rigid.
Well, the common strategy, and it's a bit paradoxical, is not to deny the existence of evil. You can't.
Of course not.
Instead, it's to question the hidden, unspoken assumptions that are sort of woven into those premises. That is the only place you can find any room to build an argument.
Okay, so let's start with that first one, the assumption about being all-powerful. What happens if we start to question what omnipotence really means?
This is where you open up a really crucial distinction. The traditional philosophical understanding is that omnipotence means the ability to do anything that is logically possible.
Logically possible, not just anything.
Right. The argument is that even an all-powerful being is bound by the laws of logic. So, for example, God can't create a four-sided triangle. God can't make a rock so heavy that he can't lift it.
Because those are just contradictions in terms. They're not describing a task, they're describing nonsense.
Exactly. It's a constraint on existence, not a lack of power. So the challenge to premise one is that the statement God could prevent all evil might actually be hiding one of those logical impossibilities.
How so?
Well, the defense argues that if preventing all evil would require violating a greater necessary good, like, for instance, the existence of genuine moral freedom, then the action itself becomes a logical contradiction.
You're saying it's like asking God to create a world with free will that guarantees no one ever uses that free will badly.
Precisely. It's like asking for a four-sided triangle. So the assumption in premise one that God could prevent all evil without sacrificing some higher value, that's what gets challenged.
Okay, and then there's a challenge to premise three, the assumption that a good God must value the absence of suffering above all else.
And this is where theodicies really, come into their own. They move beyond that tight syllogism of the logical problem and into what philosophers now call the evidential problem of evil.
What's the difference there?
The evidential problem asks a slightly different question. It's not why does evil exist at all, but why does there seem to be so much gratuitous or unnecessary suffering?
Or sheer quantity of it.
The quantity and the quality. And believers counter that assumption in premise three by arguing that a perfectly good God might have morally justifiable, though maybe not immediately obvious, reasons to allow some evils.
The idea being that these evils are necessary steps toward achieving some vastly greater cosmic good that couldn't be achieved any other way.
Exactly. They don't deny that God wants to prevent unnecessary evil, but they question whether we, with our tiny, limited scope, can truly determine which suffering is unnecessary from an infinite cosmic perspective.
This distinction is so important because it forces us to get more granular about what we even mean by evil. We can't really address the problem until we distinguish between the different types of suffering we see.
It's absolutely necessary. You have to. If we want to get to any successful theodicies, we have to stop treating evil as this single monolithic concept. Philosophers and theologians, they find it essential to divide suffering into two major types because different types of evil demand completely different explanations.
Great, so let's start with the first one, moral evil. This is the one we usually think of, the one with accountability and blame attached.
Moral evil is any suffering that flows directly and proximately from the free choices, the intentions, and the actions of human beings. So this covers everything from the huge scale, genocide, wars, systemic oppression, injustice.
All the way down to the individual level.
Right. Murder, theft, cruelty, willful neglect. This type of evil is rooted in human agency and, well, moral failure.
The explanation here seems a bit more intuitive, at least on the surface, because you can immediately trace the cause back to a moral agent. Someone did this.
You can.
But then there's the much, much more difficult category.
Okay.
The one that often brings these intellectual defenses completely crashing down. And that's natural evil.
Yes. Natural evil is all the suffering that is not obviously or directly caused by human moral choices. This includes massive geological events like earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, huge storms.
And biological stuff, too.
Huge category. Biological misfortunes, so viruses, pandemics, aggressive cancers, genetic diseases, birth defects, and even just the pain that's inherent in the cycle of life itself, predation, decay, death, which happens completely regardless of any human moral choices.
The relevance of this distinction is just.
Yeah.
It's profound. It shapes the entire debate. A solution that relies on free human choice might, plausibly address a war, which is a moral evil.
It can, yes.
But that same solution becomes completely irrelevant when we ask why a child is born with a painful, debilitating genetic disease, or why an asteroid strike wiped out the dinosaurs.
Precisely. The explanatory power of any defense that's proposed hinges on its ability to address both of those types. If a theodicy only accounts for one category, it's just seen as incomplete. And the struggle to account for natural evil is what historically forced the development of much more complex and, frankly, more speculative responses, which I think we're about to get into.
Okay, so let's start with the first big response. This is the free will defense. And it's arguably the most influential philosophical response, certainly in Western theology. And it focuses its power primarily on addressing the challenge from moral evil.
Right. This theodicy rests on a single but very powerful foundational value judgment. And that judgment is this, that the existence of genuine, meaningful, autonomous creatures is a greater good than any world populated by merely programmed entities.
No matter how happy those programmed entities may be.
No matter how happy or comfortable they are. The premise is that God's goal is to create beings who are capable of genuine chosen love and real moral responsibility. And that capability is impossible without one crucial condition.
True choice.
True choice. For things like love or sacrifice or commitment to be real, the creature has to possess the genuine capacity to choose both good and evil.
It's the whole if I'm forced to love you, it's not actually love argument.
It's not love, it's programming. Therefore, the moment genuine freedom is granted, the possibility of its misuse, which is moral evil, becomes a necessary risk. It's the unavoidable price you pay for maximizing the value of that freedom. So moral evil is seen as a byproduct of a necessary good.
And the conclusion there is that God allows the evil as a consequence of freedom, but God is not the direct author or producer of the evil itself. The responsibility lies with the free agent who actually made the choice.
And this is how proponents try to maintain God's omnibenevolence. God is sorrowful about the evil, but respects the integrity of the freedom that was granted. And this brings us right back to that paradox of omnipotence we were just discussing.
The contradiction. The idea that even an all-powerful God can't violate the laws of logic, which includes, in this case, forcing a creature to be truly free, while at the same time guaranteeing it can only choose good.
That's the philosophical firewall. If God were to intervene every single time a free agent decided to do something morally wrong, if God physically restrained the hand of every potential thief or, instantly convinced every liar to tell the truth,
then freedom would just be an illusion.
It would vanish instantly. The world would become a puppet show, an illusion of choice. Or the inhabitants would be elevated to a state of moral perfection they didn't earn, which would destroy the value that's inherent in freely chosen virtue. Therefore, allowing moral evil is seen as an unavoidable logical necessity required to secure that greater good of human autonomy.
That does make a pretty robust and powerful case for explaining, human cruelty, oppression, all of that. But, and this is a big but, this defense, as persuasive as it might be for moral failures, it runs into some really significant intellectual and, frankly, existential problems the moment we broaden our definition of suffering.
The limits are absolutely crucial to understanding how the debate evolved. The first and the most famous limit is the massive scope of natural evils, which we touched on earlier.
Right. If all this suffering comes from the misuse of human freedom, how does the free will defense account for a massive tsunami or a cancer diagnosis?
It fails. It fails to provide a direct explanation. Why would human freedom necessitate the pain of a genetic disorder or a sudden devastating earthquake? Since these events are not caused by human moral agency, the free will defense is just. It's rendered irrelevant.
Now, you did mention earlier that some proponents try to bridge that gap. They try to extend the scope of free will to non-human entities.
They do. It's a kind of cosmic extension of the argument. Some traditional theodicies suggest that the origin of natural evil isn't rooted in human freedom at all, but in the moral failure of spiritual beings, fallen angels, demons, other cosmic forces.
So these beings, by misusing their freedom, cause some kind of disruption in the natural order of the universe.
That's the idea, that their fall led to geological chaos, biological imperfection, vulnerability to disease. It's an attempt to keep the causal mechanism free choice, causing suffering intact.
But it requires a whole lot of untestable metaphysical speculation to support that argument.
A huge amount. And many modern philosophers and theologians find that step a bit too speculative to be convincing.
Okay, so beyond the huge problem of natural evil, the defense also faces a challenge related to scale, which philosophers call the evidential or quantitative problem of evil. It's the problem of disproportionate suffering.
Right. This critique, it accepts the premise that freedom requires risk. It says, okay, fine. But it then asks whether the resulting suffering is wildly, crazily disproportionate to the value of the freedom that caused it.
For example, does a small, momentary act of human jealousy really need to spiral into a catastrophic war that kills millions of people?
Exactly. If freedom is the goal, critics ask, could God not have imposed some limits on the consequences of misused freedom without actually eliminating the freedom itself?
It raises that question of why there isn't some kind of cosmic failsafe. I mean, if God respects our freedom to choose, does God also have to respect a consequence that completely annihilates all possibility of future free choice for generations, like a nuclear winter or something?
This is the immense difficulty. If God were to intervene to mitigate the consequence, you could argue that our freedom might feel compromised. But if God doesn't intervene, the resulting suffering just feels incomprehensible, and that raises the problem of gratuitous pain.
Pain that serves no purpose.
None at all. Critics argue that a benevolent God would minimize, if not eliminate, suffering that serves no discernible purpose, even if free will is maintained. And the fact that the suffering so often appears maximal and completely gratuitous is, for them, powerful evidence against God's benevolence.
And then there's the final limitation, and this is the one that I think hits the hardest emotionally. The suffering of those who are not moral agents at all. The free will defense rests on the value of moral responsibility, but what about those who don't have any?
This is the devastating final flaw for many of the free will defense. If the whole justification for allowing suffering is to facilitate moral agency, what possible justification is there for the profound pain experienced by innocent, non-moral agents?
And our source material identifies three key groups here.
Yes. First, infants and babies. Those who suffer and die long before moral agency ever develops. Their pain can't be traced to their own freedom. Second, the severely cognitively impaired. Those whose capacity for moral choice is fundamentally limited.
And third, a huge category, animals. Sentient beings who clearly experience pain but are not considered moral agents capable of choosing good or evil.
For these groups, their suffering is not the price they pay for their own freedom. It's merely incidental to the operation of the universe, or a terrible consequence of someone else's actions. The free will defense offers no internal justification for their pain. It has no answer.
Which forces its proponents to look somewhere else entirely for an explanation.
Which is precisely why the philosophical conversation has to shift. Since the free will defense struggles so profoundly with natural evil and with innocent suffering, we have to change our focus from the cause of suffering, human choice, to maybe the purpose or the consequence of suffering.
And that transition leads us right into the second major response, the soul-making or character-building approach. This is what's known as a teleological response, right? It's focused on the ultimate goal, the end purpose of existence, rather than the immediate cause.
Exactly. This approach demands a really foundational reevaluation of what God's objective in creation even is. The premise here is that God's goal is not merely to create a comfortable environment, what you called a paradise theme park earlier,
Right.
but to forge mature, virtuous, and deeply compassionate beings. And what that means is that the world must be a functional, challenging environment where real moral growth is actually possible.
So, in this view, the existence of difficulties, of pain, of loss, it's not an error in the system. It's a necessary, integral component of the operating system designed for human spiritual maturation.
That's correct. The world is structured as an environment where struggle and loss and difficulty are real possibilities, and you have to ask why. Well, it's because these high-order virtues, the qualities that are most valued by theological systems, they just can't develop in a vacuum.
You're saying true courage requires genuine danger.
It has to. Steadfast faith requires doubt and difficulty to overcome. Forgiveness is meaningless if you've never been wronged.
And the person who has actually endured a genuine tragedy can offer a kind of empathy, a profound compassion, that is just philosophically unavailable to someone who has lived a perfectly sheltered, comfortable life. The suffering theoretically transforms the person who endures it.
It transforms the suffering from what looks like meaningless waste into a potentially powerful catalyst for moral development. The virtue that's achieved through struggle, through freely choosing to do good in the face of immense difficulty, is considered intrinsically more valuable than any virtue that was just, programmed or gifted at birth.
So the world in this view is like a rigorous school or a training ground for the soul.
That's the analogy, yes.
This sounds pretty comprehensive. It offers a higher purpose for both moral evil and natural evil, since natural evil provides that backdrop of unpredictable difficulties that are necessary for character testing. But, as we saw with the free will defense, This explanation also faces some incredibly heavy intellectual scrutiny.
Oh, absolutely. It faces three main challenges that really prevent it from being a fully satisfying explanation, especially when you confront it with the most extreme examples of evil.
So let's start with the one that critics always bring up first, the scale problem. Couldn't God achieve the same character growth with significantly less intense, less horrific suffering?
This is the quantitative critique, but applied to the purpose rather than the cause. We might concede, okay, difficulty is necessary for growth. But critics then demand to know why the suffering has to reach such a horrific scale.
If a small hardship can build patience, why does it take a catastrophic global famine to teach the world gratitude? The suffering we see often seems wildly, crazily disproportionate to any moral good that could conceivably be derived from it.
Right, if the universe is a school, as the analogy goes, then the curriculum seems unnecessarily brutal. It almost demonstrates a massive inefficiency on the part of the divine teacher.
And that leads directly to the second, and I think perhaps the most difficult moral challenge, which is the justification risk. When we apply this defense to the greatest human tragedies, genocide, systemic abuse, institutional cruelty, it risks minimizing the trauma.
Or worse, it can appear to retroactively justify the horrific evils by claiming they serve some higher purpose.
Right. If a devastating tragedy happens and we immediately say, oh, is God's plan to build character, that response just seems morally obtuse and deeply insensitive to the victims and the survivors.
It risks eroding our essential moral outrage. And that outrage is what drives us to fight injustice, to intervene immediately. If every tragedy is just seen as a necessary component of God's ultimate plan, it can dull the urgency to stop it now.
If the focus shifts.
It shifts from the obligation to eliminate suffering to the appreciation of its ultimate, distant, or abstract good, and many critics find that ethically unacceptable. They argue that the priority of a moral agent should always be to prevent the evil, regardless of its theoretical future benefit.
And then there's the simple reality check. The crushing effect. The whole soul-making model is built on the assumption that suffering leads to virtue. But we know empirically that's not always true. Suffering often just breaks people.
The defense carries this inherent optimism that is just so often violated by reality. For many, many individuals, suffering is not a crucible that forges character. It's a weight that crushes the spirit. It leads to despair, to cynicism, to moral collapse, addiction, crippling mental health crises.
So for these victims, the world wasn't a developmental school. It was an unrelenting torture chamber, and they were destroyed by the curriculum.
They were.
So if that happens, if they fail the curriculum, where is the ultimate justification for their pain?
And that forces the proponent of the soul-making view to fall back on the necessary caveat. They have to rely on some ultimate unseen resolution.
An afterlife.
An afterlife, or a state of existence beyond our current comprehension. Defenders of this view have to concede that the ultimate good, the fully developed, mature, virtuous soul, may only be realized later. They ask us to trust that the full picture will show a positive outcome for everyone who is crushed, even if we can't possibly perceive it now.
So the price of this defense is accepting a massive intellectual gap that can only be filled by faith.
That's it. It's a leap of faith.
So if the soul-making defense tries to look beyond this present life for a justification, our next approach takes that timeline expansion to the absolute extreme. We're shifting now to traditions that emphasize karma and rebirth like Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, where suffering is viewed through a dramatically multi-lifetime lens.
This philosophical pivot is profound. It's a complete game changer because it solves the problem of injustice by totally redefining the scope of the moral agent. If you assume existence is limited to a single lifetime, injustice is just rampant everywhere you look.
It seems obvious.
But if you assume the soul or the spirit is eternal, then the causal chain extends infinitely in both directions, and the moral system can be perfectly just over the long haul.
And the mechanism for that justice is karma, this universal moral law of action and consequence. So how does that law account for suffering in the immediate sense?
Karma operates as an impersonal, strict law of moral cause and effect, much like gravity is a law of physics. Actions which are karma in one life create tendencies, consequences, or what are called samskaras that then ripen in subsequent lives.
So suffering experienced in this life is not random or arbitrary. It's the consequence, the necessary ripening of actions that were undertaken in previous existences.
That's the framework. It provides a complete explanation for what looks to us like cosmic injustice. If we see a person who appears totally innocent in this life but is afflicted with immense, seemingly undeserved suffering, The karmic view would suggest they are not actually innocent when you measure it across the entire arc of their being.
So the apparent injustice is just a function of our very limited temporal viewpoint.
Exactly. Our perspective is too narrow. The universe, in this view, operates with perfect moral regularity, extending far beyond this current life. For instance, in some Hindu and Buddhist schools, the suffering you experience today might be linked to what's called prarabdha karma.
And what's that?
It's the portion of all your past actions, your sankshipha karma, that has been allotted to ripen in this present lifetime. It's like a debt being paid. It's invisible to us, but it's perfectly clear to the moral accounting system of the cosmos.
This completely reframes the goal of life then. The objective isn't to be comfortable in your current life. It's to achieve liberation from this binding cycle of cause and consequence, the cycle of samsara.
Yes, and suffering becomes a powerful indicator. It shows that the individual is still attached to illusion or is still working through the consequences of past actions.
And it places an immense amount of responsibility entirely on the individual. You're not a victim of a cruel, arbitrary God or some random chance. You are the architect of your own destiny, and you're the recipient of your own historical actions.
Right. The suffering you experience is fundamentally a consequence of choices you made, which then motivates you to improve your ethical conduct now to create a better future.
Just as the soul-making defense risked justifying horror, this doctrine faces a very similar charge, that it can lead to fatalism, or worse, blaming the victim.
This is a critique that has been leveled against these traditions throughout history. If every bit of suffering I see is just someone's deserved consequence, why should I intervene? Why should I fight against what appears to be a perfectly running, self-correcting cosmic justice machine? The danger is intellectual passivity and social stagnation.
So how do major practitioners counter that? How do they balance that idea of karmic inevitability with the imperative for compassionate action?
The counter-argument insists that karma, when it's correctly understood, is meant to deepen personal responsibility and, crucially, compassion. The moral balance is found in recognizing that my response to the suffering I observe creates my future karma.
Ah, so your action in the present moment matters for your own future.
It's everything. If I see a person suffering, regardless of the unknown cause from a past life, and I choose to ignore them, I am deliberately creating negative karma for myself through my own apathy and lack of compassion.
So the moral law itself actually compels you to intervene.
Precisely. The system demands that a morally enlightened being acts to alleviate suffering in the present moment. The cause of the current suffering might be past life karma, but my moral action, my compassion, and my aid is what matters for my future liberation. So the doctrine, correctly understood, doesn't serve as an excuse for inaction. If anything, it intensifies the urgency for ethical behavior right here, right now. The suffering is real, and the duty to relieve it is absolute.
Okay, so let's move back towards some of the theistic philosophical traditions. Here we find responses that don't really rely on a specific mechanism like free will or a strict cause and effect like karma, but more on the vast scope of divine wisdom. This is the mystical or greater good approach.
Right, and this approach asks us to reconsider the very limits of human knowledge itself.
How so?
It tries to neutralize the problem of evil by positing that human reason is simply too limited, too finite to grasp the totality of existence. And therefore, any human judgment about what is unnecessary suffering is ultimately premature or even arrogant.
This is where that famous analogy of the tapestry comes in, which is so powerful for illustrating our limited perspective.
It's a great analogy. It suggests that we are viewing reality like a small child looking at the backside of an intricate tapestry. From that limited perspective, all we see are knots and loose threads and seemingly random, ugly patterns.
And those are our instances of pain and suffering.
Exactly. They appear meaningless and chaotic. But the analogy goes, if we could step back and view the entire massive cosmic tapestry from the divine perspective, from the front, we would see that every single knot, every dark thread was absolutely necessary for the creation of the final, magnificent, and comprehensive design.
So the implication then is that what appears to be completely pointless suffering to us must be permitted because it's fundamentally interwoven with a greater necessary order. It leads to a good that couldn't exist otherwise.
It becomes a statement of faith in cosmic coherence. Suffering isn't desirable, but removing it would necessitate removing some interconnected, indispensable good that we just can't comprehend from our vantage point. The permission of evil is an indirect necessity for maximizing the total, comprehensive good of the universe.
This argument seems particularly useful in addressing those large-scale, impersonal, natural evils that the free will defense struggled with so much, especially through the specific argument of the law-governed universe.
This is one of the most powerful and, I think, rational subsets of the greater good approach. It argues that for human existence to have any meaning at all, the universe has to operate by fixed, dependable, natural laws.
Think about all the massive goods that rely on that regularity.
Everything, the entire enterprise of science and prediction, the reliability that's necessary for love and trust to even exist, and the possibility of genuine, effective moral action. If you can't predict the outcome of your actions, morality is meaningless.
If gravity worked differently every Monday, or if water boiled at a different temperature every hour, no meaningful human endeavor, no science, no complex society could ever develop.
Exactly. Our source material really emphasizes that this stability is a prerequisite for any meaningful existence. But, and here's the catch, the very stability that allows for these enormous goods must also, inevitably, allow for the possibility of disasters.
Gravity allows us to stand on the ground, but it also ensures a falling rock will crush us.
Plate tectonics slowly renews the planet's surface, but it also causes earthquakes. The laws themselves are neutral in their operation.
Which leads to the critical question of divine intervention. If God constantly intervened to prevent every instance of suffering that results from these natural laws, what would happen to the world?
Well, if God were constantly putting a hand on the scale, slowing every falling object just before it hits someone, nudging every tectonic plate back into place, correcting every single genetic mutation, the universe would lose its regularity and its predictability.
Our ability to learn, to plan, to exercise any meaningful freedom would just vanish.
It would. If God keeps breaking the rules to save us from the consequences of the rules, the world ceases to be a stable reality where genuine moral choice can be made. Therefore, the existence of a stable, law-governed universe, even with its catastrophic consequences, is itself a greater good that is necessary for human freedom and scientific knowledge.
So the outcome of this whole approach is really a call to humility and trust. It doesn't offer a specific cause for any one tragedy, but it's an invitation to step back and just acknowledge the limits of our own rational inquiry.
Its strength is its humility, the acceptance that perhaps there are truths that are too vast for our finite minds. However, this is also where it faces its steepest intellectual challenge.
Which is the skeptic's reply, that calling something a mystery is just a fancy way of giving up on the problem entirely.
That's the charge. Skeptics argue that this approach conveniently labels any unsolved, particularly horrific or intellectually difficult tragedy as an unanswerable mystery. Instead of providing a justified answer, a theodicy, it amounts to a claim of human inability.
And it's criticized as being non-explanatory.
And for making the belief system logically unfalsifiable. If everything is just part of an incomprehensible plan, then no amount of evidence, no matter how horrible, can ever challenge the premise of a good God.
So we have spent a considerable amount of time now examining responses that are trying to defend the existence of a good, all-powerful God in spite of suffering. Now we have to turn to the non-theistic viewpoint, where the existence of intense, seemingly gratuitous suffering is taken as the most compelling evidence against that central hypothesis.
Right. For the atheist, the problem of evil isn't a paradox that needs to be justified. It's the strongest, most direct proof that the premises defining the classical God are empirically false. The existence of suffering isn't seen as a mystery to be solved, but as a datum point that strongly favors one conclusion over the other.
And that conclusion being that this chaotic, painful, and often beautiful blend that we see in the universe is most simply explained by the absence of a benevolent, omnipotent director.
That is the non-theistic conclusion. Suffering is viewed as a purely natural fact. It arises inevitably from the processes of a completely unguided universe.
From the random forces of physics.
The brutal competitive mechanisms of biological evolution and the imperfect, fragile social structures that have been built by morally fallible human beings. In this view, there is no external cosmic guarantee of ultimate justice or resolution. Pain is simply a byproduct of an unguided, dynamic reality.
And if that's the conclusion, that suffering is natural and unguided, the moral implication for humanity changes completely.
It places an immense burden of responsibility directly onto us. If there's no divine safety net, no unseen plan, no karmic balancing that will eventually make sense of the pain, then the entire ethical imperative to reduce suffering falls solely and squarely upon humanity.
So our only recourse is compassion, science.
Science, technological advance, political reform. The source of meaning shifts entirely from some divine purpose to direct human action.
I find this perspective raises a really fascinating moral implication for the theistic arguments we just explored. It's the charge that trying to fit every single tragedy into some divine plan risks dulling our moral sensitivity and our urgency.
This is a powerful ethical challenge, and it's directed particularly at those soul-making and greater good theodicies. The question is critical. If we convince ourselves that a tragedy, a famine, a senseless act of violence is ultimately for the best, according to some higher incomprehensible design, do we maintain the same fierce, immediate moral outrage that is required to actively fight against that injustice?
It suggests there might be an inverse relationship. The stronger your belief in an ultimate safety net or a divine purpose, maybe the weaker your immediate drive to personally intervene and stop the suffering, because, well, the suffering must be serving some higher end.
Exactly. The non-theistic viewpoint argues that the urgency comes from the recognition that the suffering is pointless. It served no grand purpose, it's just a natural calamity. And it's precisely because the universe offers no higher safety net that human compassion becomes so absolutely vital.
And this leads to a completely alternative understanding of meaning itself.
Yes. The non-theistic argument is that humans create powerful meaning and nobility by standing together against suffering. Meaning isn't discovered in the suffering itself. Meaning is generated by our collective, compassionate, and rational response to it.
So by recognizing the shared, fragile nature of our existence,
our mutual effort to relieve pain becomes the ultimate source of value and moral purpose in what might be a cold, indifferent universe. We impose justice where there is none inherent.
Okay, so to complete our intellectual landscape, we have to move to traditions that approach the problem of evil, not by seeking a reason for it or by rejecting the divine premise, but by challenging the very concept of evil as an absolute category. This is the perspective of totality that you find in non-dual and mystical systems.
Right. These approaches, which are deeply rooted in philosophies like Brahmin and Hinduism, the Tao, or the Mahayana Buddhist concept of emptiness or sunyata, they argue that the problem of evil is fundamentally rooted in our limited, fragmented way of perceiving reality. The categories we use, good versus evil, are constructs of the ego and of human language.
So if reality is an undivided, non-dual whole, how does that conceptualization change the definition of good and evil?
The core idea is that from the highest, deepest metaphysical standpoint, reality is an absolute, unified, inseparable whole. This totality is beyond our dualistic categories. When we, as finite beings bound by ego perception, try to grasp this totality, we inevitably chop it up. We create pairs of opposites, self and other, light and dark, good and evil.
So our mental categories of good and evil aren't ultimate cosmic truths, but they're relative constructs that are tied specifically to our limited, human, egocentric needs and desires.
That is the implication. Evil, in this view, is often defined as non-being, or lack, or just an incomplete viewing of the totality. It's the shadow cast by the light. You can't have the light of goodness without the possibility of the shadow of evil, just as you can't have the upside of a wave without the downside.
So from the non-dual perspective, everything is ultimately part of an inseparable whole, and the tension of the problem of evil only arises when we mistake our relative dualistic perspective for the absolute truth.
Exactly. It offers a powerful, though I admit deeply abstract, reframing of the paradox. Instead of asking why a good God permits something bad, we start to question whether good and bad hold any ultimate meaning within the totality of being.
The problem of evil is partly redefined as a problem of perspective.
That's a great way to put it. Human suffering and pain are absolutely real at the relative level of existence, the level where we have to eat and breathe and act morally. But at the metaphysical level of ultimate reality, the concept of a flaw, an error, or an ultimate imbalance in the universe just dissolves, because the universe is seen as inherently perfect and complete in its dynamic unity.
But doesn't this perspective risk a kind of intellectual quietism? If everything is perfect in the totality, why should I bother acting to change my painful reality right now?
And that is a crucial clarification to make. The non-dual perspective requires acknowledging the dichotomy. While ultimate reality is unified and perfect, we still live and operate in the world of duality and suffering. Therefore, this perspective does not eliminate the emotional or physical pain of suffering, and it does not negate the requirement for compassionate action.
So the suffering is real and has to be relieved in the relative world of human moral duty.
It has to be.
So it reframes the intellectual puzzle without removing the ethical obligation.
Exactly. It tells us why the question is so intellectually difficult to resolve, because the very terms we're using, good, evil, God, are products of our limited perception, but it absolutely retains the human duty to relieve the suffering of others.
This has been a really extensive exploration of philosophy and theology, trying to grapple with what is just the most fundamental challenge to meaning. And we've seen just how diverse and sophisticated these intellectual responses are, and also why none of them seem to manage to provide a full, globally accepted resolution.
To synthesize the landscape of these intellectual responses, we saw believers across different traditions attribute the existence of evil to the necessary risk of free will, or to the character-forging demands of the soul-making curriculum.
Or to the long-term balancing required by karma.
Right, or ultimately to a divine plan that is simply beyond human comprehension, existing in the vast law-governed universe.
And then we saw the powerful counter-argument from non-believers who offer a concise, rational solution to the intellectual paradox. They posit that the existence of chaotic, pointless suffering is the clearest empirical proof for the absence of an all-powerful, perfectly good ruler.
Which makes suffering a natural reality that we must fight alone.
Exactly. Yet, for every intellectual solution, the existential core of the problem it remains. Why does terrible, unnecessary pain happen to those who do not deserve it? The question persists because, as we've seen, the intellectual solution so often fails to satisfy the emotional ache.
Or it just runs into massive philosophical limitations, whether it's the problem of innocent suffering for the free will defense, or the scale problem for the soul-making theodicy.
And that persistence leads us to the final critical conclusion drawn from all our sources, that the most honest and functional human response to the problem of evil requires not one, but two simultaneous commitments, regardless of your ultimate metaphysical answer.
First, we are obligated to think carefully about the philosophical puzzle. We have to understand the logic, the nuance, the intellectual constraints of all these different responses. We owe it to ourselves to understand the architecture of belief and skepticism, and to pursue knowledge rigorously.
And second, and this is just as important, we must act compassionately in the face of real suffering. Our intellectual explanation for why the tragedy occurred, whether it's karma, random chance, or some mysterious plan, it must never provide a justification for apathy.
It can't interfere with our immediate human duty to alleviate the pain that is right in front of us.
Yeah.
The entire weight of this deep dive, which is centered on that question, if God exists, why is there evil and suffering? It's powerful because it forces us to confront two limits simultaneously: the limits of our understanding of the cosmic order and the absolute depth of our responsibility to one another in the face of that confusing reality.
So what is your chosen response to this persistent challenge demand of your actions today? Are you prioritizing the intellectual defense of a cosmic plan? Or are you prioritizing the urgent need for human aid? And is it possible that the greatest moral act is the ability to sustain the tension between the two? That is something for you to mull over until our next deep dive.